Hello, everyone, and welcome to Larry Talks. I'm your host, Dr. Larry Doyle. Thank you for joining me. I really appreciate you being here. Now, let's get into tonight's session. Tonight, I want to talk about something that might sound technical at first, but it's actually one of the most important legal tools ever used in the Agent Orange litigation. It's called a preservation order. Recently, I had a debate with someone about this order, what it meant, how broad it was, and whether it still matters today. I'm not going to name the person because that's not really the point. The point is the principle behind the preservation order. Because the preservation order issued by Judge Jack Weinstein in the Agent Orange litigation wasn't just paperwork. It was a safeguard for the rule of law, and understanding why it exists tells us a lot about how the legal system is supposed to work. A preservation order is exactly what it sounds like. When a court issues one, it is telling the parties involved in the case that they must preserve documents and evidence related to the subject of the litigation. That means they cannot destroy them, they cannot discard them, they cannot let them disappear through routine record schedules. They must preserve them so that the truth can be examined. In ordinary cases, that might apply to a limited number of documents, but the Agent Orange litigation was not an ordinary case. When Judge Weinstein issued the order, in the late 1970s, the federal court in New York was handling one of the largest pieces of litigation in American history. Thousands of Vietnam veterans had filed suit claiming that exposure to herbicides had caused serious health problems. The case eventually became known as MDL 381. And Judge Jack Weinstein, the federal judge overseeing the case, understood something important. He understood that evidence necessary to answer the questions in that litigation existed inside large institutions, government agencies, military departments, chemical companies, and if those documents were destroyed, whether intentionally or simply through normal administrative processes, the court might never be able to determine the truth. So Judge Weinstein issued a preservation order. The language of that order required that documents related to herbicides used in Vietnam be preserved until the litigation was resolved. That meant documents relating to the production, testing, transportation, storage, spraying, and health effects. In other words, the entire documentary history of the program. Now, here's the important part that matters. A preservation order is not simply a suggestion, it's not advice, and it's not a recommendation. It's a command from a federal court. When a court issues an order like that, every party involved in the case is required to follow it, because that is how the rule of law works. The court establishes the rules, the parties obey those rules, and the evidence remains available so the truth can be examined. Without that structure, litigation becomes impossible. Think about what happens if the documents are not preserved. Evidence disappears, records vanish, memories fade, and the ability of a court or the public to understand what actually happened becomes weaker and weaker. That's why preservation orders exist. They are the legal system's way of saying, before we argue about the facts, we must first protect the evidence. The rule of law is one of the core principles of a democratic society. It means that law applies equally to everyone. Citizens, corporations, government agencies. No one is above it. When a federal judge issues an order, the legitimacy of the legal system depends on the expectation that the order will be followed, not selectively, not partially, but completely. Because once people begin to believe that court orders can simply be ignored, something important begins to erode: confidence in the system itself. That's why debate about the preservation order matters, not because of personal disagreements, not because of academic arguments, but because the preservation order represents a commitment to something bigger, a commitment that evidence will be protected, a commitment that courts will have access to the truth, and a commitment that the rule of law will still mean something. You may wonder why I'm bringing this up. The answer is simple. About 50 years ago, when Agent Orange's story began to grow and public scrutiny increased, the government faced a choice. They could allow the evidence to speak for itself, or they could try to control the narrative surrounding it. What began during that period was a process that in many ways continues today. That process involves treating a preservation order, which is a binding court order from a federal court, as though it were something optional, something that it could be interpreted, adjusted, or even ignored if it became inconvenient. Once that attitude took hold, something predictable began to happen. If one agency treated the preservation order loosely, others began to see it as permission to do the same. And when that happens, the consequences are exactly what you would expect. Records are lost, records are destroyed, records simply cease to exist. I have in my possession a document that has been described to me as one of the only ones still in existence. It is a shipping document showing herbicides sent to Machinado, Okinawa. According to what I've been told, the rest of the documents in that series were destroyed. If that is true, then those destructions occurred despite the preservation order issued by the federal court overseeing the Agent Orange litigation. And once those shipping documents were gone, something else happened. It became nearly impossible to determine how many shipments of herbicides actually reached Okinawa. So when we talk about the preservation order and the Agent Orange litigation, we're not just talking about a piece of legal procedure. We're talking about a promise made by the legal system, a promise that the evidence would be preserved, that the truth would remain accessible, and that the law would apply to everyone involved. Because at the end of the day, the rule of law only survives if people treat it as something real, something binding, something worth protecting. And that's why the preservation order matters, not just to a court case, but to the principle that justice depends on evidence and evidence depends on preservation. If you found tonight's session interesting, or if it resonated with you for other reasons, please share it with friends and family.